What if I told you that some of the most terrifying warriors of World War II weren't foreign soldiers, weren't elite units of the Axis powers, and weren't even officially acknowledged by the US military? What if the most brutal, psychological, and utterly unseen operations of the war were carried out by Americans Apaches from the Southwest, whose methods were so ruthless that the government sealed the records for decades? Before I take you deeper into this hidden history, I need you to do two things. Comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Because the story you're about to hear has been suppressed for more than 80 years, and the algorithms don't want you to see it. Your subscription is the only way these secrets survive. On the morning of December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor fell, a telegram arrived at the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. It called for the immediate presence of tribal council members at Fort WWII, citing national security and cultural preservation. By nightfall, 12 Apache elders had made the long journey across the desert. What awaited them inside the windowless meeting room would never be documented in official war records. Across from them sat 3 Army officers stripped of name tags and insignia. The eldest, a man the Apaches would later call only the Colonel, placed a leather folder on the table but did not open it. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low, "we are about to ask you to create warriors the world has never seen. Ghosts who fight in ways that will never be acknowledged by this government." The tribal chairman, Joseph Tissos, studied him silently, before replying with a simple, chilling truth. "Our grandfathers knew how to make an enemy afraid of the dark. If you want us to teach your soldiers, understand this comes with a cost. Men who learn these ways do not return as they were." What the military proposed went beyond code talkers, beyond ordinary warfare. This was about weaponizing ancient Apache tactics, forging soldiers into shadows that could strike anywhere, unseen, unheard, and unforgettable. And over the next years, those shadows would haunt every theater of war, from the dense jungles of the Pacific to the forests of Europe, leaving a trail of fear the world never knew existed. By January 1942, the first group of Apache volunteers had arrived at a remote training facility 30 miles northeast of Fort WWII. The location had once been sacred hunting grounds, chosen deliberately so the men could feel the presence of their ancestors. The military wanted more than soldiers, they wanted shadows. Men who could move like the wind, strike without warning, and disappear before anyone knew they had been there. 147 men reported for training. By the end of 6 grueling months, only 63 remained. The rest vanished from military records, their families receiving vague telegrams claiming reassignment to classified assignments. Inside the canyon, the training was unlike anything the US Army had ever attempted. Men were pushed to the edge of human endurance, learning to navigate terrain silently, survive for weeks without supplies, and strike fear into the hearts of enemies before any physical confrontation. Lieutenant Robert Chen, one of the few non-Apache officers allowed to observe, wrote in his journal, "I watched men become ghosts. They leave signs they were here, but we cannot see them. By the time they strike, the enemy is already broken." He recorded the fear in the eyes of the instructors themselves, a fear that this knowledge, once unleashed, could never be contained. The techniques combined ancient Apache stealth and psychological methods with experimental technology, subsonic sound devices, chemical compounds that induced hallucinations, and even tactics designed to make soldiers feel as though they were being hunted by spirits. Every element was designed to distort perception, to manipulate the mind, to create terror that could not be fought conventionally. By mid-1942, these shadow units were ready for deployment. They would enter enemy territory not merely to fight, but to unmake the enemy psychologically, leaving soldiers terrified, disoriented, and in some cases driven to madness before a single bullet was fired. The war had just begun, but what the world was about to face was something entirely new and deeply hidden. By June 1942, the first Apache shadow units were deployed to the Philippines, 12 men sent deep behind Japanese lines in the dense jungles of Mindanao. Their official mission was intelligence gathering, but the reality was far more sinister. These men were trained to create fear, to haunt the enemy's every step, and to strike with surgical precision. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji, a Japanese officer, wrote in his diary after their first encounter, "We were hunted by something we could not see. Men disappeared, then bodies were found with eyes wide open, faces frozen in terror. No footprints. No sounds, only the sense that someone was always watching." The Apaches moved like shadows through the undergrowth, leaving subtle signs of their presence. A bent branch here, a faint symbol carved into a tree there, just enough to make the enemy question their own senses. They combined this with experimental chemical compounds that induced hallucinations, Subsonic devices that rattled the mind and psychological warfare techniques learned from centuries of Apache tradition. By the time they struck, entire enemy units were already broken, terrified, and disoriented. Back in Arizona, the training facility had expanded to house over 300 men and instructors. Soldiers stationed nearby reported eerie phenomena, lights that danced in impossible patterns, footsteps without origin, voices that whispered in the night. Captain James Morrison, a base psychiatrist, filed a report in November 1942, noting persistent nightmares and paranoia among soldiers who had even brief contact with the trainees. Some have requested reassignment to frontline combat rather than remain on base, he wrote. They fear what these men have become. His concerns were immediately classified. Meanwhile, the shadow units spread across every theater of war. In Europe, German soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge reported being hunted by ghost-like forces. A battalion surrendered without firing a shot, describing attackers that appeared and vanished at will. In the Pacific, Japanese troops called them the Silent Ones, reporting entire command posts found empty, officers dead from apparent cardiac events, with no signs of struggle or combat. The Apache units had become the most terrifying psychological weapon in modern warfare. Their actions so efficient that the war machine itself struggled to comprehend them. Yet, the cost of this power was immense. Soldiers who survived deployments returned changed or didn't return at all. Reports from field hospitals in the Philippines in 1945 described men wandering in combat psychosis, speaking in unknown languages, demonstrating uncanny abilities, and existing in a state between consciousness and something else entirely. Families were told their loved ones had died in combat, but no bodies were ever returned. These men had become ghosts, both in life and in official records. Across the Southwest, the pattern of disappearances continued. Young Apache men were approached, under the guise of special opportunities, recruited into secret programs that in reality never ended. The Shadow Warrior program had gone underground, evolving alongside the Cold War, and its legacy extended far beyond World War I. 1943, it became clear the Apaches were no longer just soldiers. They were instruments of fear, carriers of a psychological weapon that would ripple through generations, a program whose full scope remained hidden, classified and incomprehensible to the world. June 1942, the dense jungles of Mindanao became a nightmare for Japanese troops, but almost no one knew why. 12 Apache operatives, barely visible through the foliage, moved with a precision that was terrifyingly unnatural. They left subtle signs of their presence, a slight movement of vegetation, a single shoe placed unnaturally, a faint scratching of a tree bark that suggested something inhuman had passed. By nightfall, entire enemy squads were incapacitated, not by bullets but by terror. Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto recorded in his diary, his hands shaking, "We found Sergeant Nakamura hanging from a tree. His throat was slit but no blood touched the ground. Around the tree, markings moved when looked at directly. The men speak of demons and spirits. I do not know what hunts us, but it is winning." By the next morning, 6 more soldiers were dead in their sleep, eyes wide with an expression of absolute horror. 2 Apache operatives had caused the psychological collapse of an entire battalion. Every strike, every movement was calculated to break minds before bodies. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge produced a scene equally unnerving. A German battalion, well-trained and disciplined, reported sightings of ghost soldiers' figures who vanished into the mist, appearing in impossible positions, leaving no tracks, no sound, only fear. Oberleutnant Hans Richter's intercepted letter to his wife described men and markings moving like shadows, their eyes reflecting the moonlight as if they were animals, and how his unit's morale crumbled before they even engaged. Within 3 days, the battalion surrendered without firing a shot. The psychological terror inflicted by the Apache-trained operatives had achieved what conventional warfare could not. The technology they carried intensified the terror. Subsonic devices that rattled the mind, chemical compounds that produced hallucinations when absorbed through the skin, even minute environmental manipulations, the leaves bent unnaturally. Footprints that appeared and vanished, everything combined to convince the enemy that they were being hunted by something beyond human. Every action was calculated to make the mind fail first, the body second. Back in Arizona, Captain Morrison's reports grew more urgent. Soldiers who had even brief contact with the operatives described intense anxiety, nightmares, and the feeling of being constantly watched. 3 requested reassignment, preferring frontline combat over staying near men who had stopped being men. The mental strain on these operatives themselves was immense. Only those whose minds could adapt to this new reality survived. By The end of 1942, the Shadow Warrior units had compiled a record of near-supernatural efficiency. Hundreds of enemy soldiers had been eliminated without direct combat, battalions broken psychologically, entire enemy positions abandoned out of sheer terror. And yet, the human cost for the operatives was staggering. Many disappeared, some were institutionalized, others returned home unrecognizable. The program had succeeded in creating weapons of fear, but it had created ghosts in its own ranks. The world was at war, but no one was prepared for the shadow that had been unleashed. And in every theater, from the jungles of the Pacific to the forests of Europe, the Apache-trained units left a chilling footprint. A trail of bodies, shattered minds, and fear that lingered long after the physical fight was overdought by late 1942. The effects of the Apache shadow units were rippling far beyond the battlefield. Word of ghost soldiers and unexplainable attacks began circulating among both Allied and Axis troops, though official reports never mentioned the Apache operatives. In the jungles of the Philippines, Japanese commanders grew paranoid, rotating troops constantly, never allowing them to settle in one position. Entire units refused to sleep in the same tent 2 nights in a row. Fear had become a weapon more deadly than guns or artillery. Meanwhile, the U.S. military began documenting disturbing incidents among the operatives themselves. Soldiers who had returned from deployments described experiences that defied explanation. Some spoke of seeing shadows move independently, of hearing whispers in languages they could not understand, of feeling a presence constantly observing them. Medical reports described extreme cases of combat psychosis, sensory hallucinations, and acute paranoia. In many cases, these men refused to follow commands, attacked fellow soldiers in sudden outbursts, or simply vanished into the wilderness, leaving only their training gear behind. At Fort WWII, Captain James Morrison's classified reports warned of a growing crisis. These men, he wrote in November 1942, have been transformed. They no longer operate entirely in the physical world. The techniques they employ are altering their perception, their instincts, their very understanding of reality. They are extraordinarily effective, but the cost may be irreparable. The Army, however, saw the results and insisted on continuing the program. Effectiveness outweighed human cost. Across the globe, the Apache-trained units spread. In the Ardennes, German forces abandoned fortified positions, citing encounters with men who seemed to appear and vanish at will, leaving behind symbols and markings that induced terror and disorientation. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers reported entire camps where men died simultaneously, showing signs of stress-induced cardiac events with no visible cause. A Marine after-action report from May 1945 described finding 80 enemy combatants dead inside a cave system, their bodies positioned to maximize psychological impact. Soldiers refused to remain in the caves, physically ill from the pervasive sense of dread. The program's secrecy only intensified its mystique. Most operatives disappeared from all official records after deployments. Families received telegrams claiming combat deaths, yet no bodies were returned. Rehabilitation programs in New Mexico were shrouded in mystery. Letters recovered decades later described men trapped in isolation, subjected to experimental treatments, and haunted by memories of battles the world would never acknowledge. Their minds had been altered permanently, some to the point of existing partially in another reality. Even after the war ended, the Apache Shadow program did not cease. During the Cold War, the skills honed in World War II found new applications in covert operations across Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Reports of unseen forces operating in enemy territory, psychological attacks, unexplained deaths, and disorientation mirrored the methods first developed in Arizona's remote canyons. The legacy of the Shadow Warrior program had extended into new generations, creating operatives who would continue to walk unseen, operating in the margins of both war and history. The question was no longer just what the operatives could do, it was what they had become. And, as the world rebuilt, the shadows they left behind remained, unseen but never forgotten, a constant reminder that some wars are fought not on battlefields, but in the minds of those who dare to enter the dark. By 1945, as the war neared its end, the true cost of the Apache Shadow program became undeniable. The operatives had achieved unparalleled battlefield success, but the human toll was catastrophic. Many men who had returned home were irrevocably changed. They spoke in languages no one recognized, moved with preternatural precision, and sometimes disappeared for days without explanation. Families whispered that their loved ones were no longer the same men who had left for the war. At the Fort WWII rehabilitation facility in New Mexico, letters and journals revealed a grim reality. Soldiers like Thomas Nache wrote of isolation, experimental treatments, and a profound psychological transformation that made reintegration nearly impossible. "We learned to become what our ancestors warned us never to become," he wrote. "And now, even home offers no peace. We are ghosts, not just to the enemy, but to our families, to ourselves." Official records, of course, listed only a handful of men, erasing the existence of over 100 others. Those who disappeared were effectively written out of history. The psychological consequences extended beyond the operatives themselves. On reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, families mourned without answers. Young Apache men continued to vanish under mysterious circumstances, often recruited under the guise of service or opportunity. Tribal police reports describe men leaving with unmarked black sedans, never to return, as if the program had extended its reach into the post-war years. Communities were left with collective trauma, struggling to reconcile pride in their warriors' skill with grief for those who never came back. Meanwhile, military analysts began to understand the long-term strategic impact. The Apache units had created a new model of warfare, psychological dominance that left enemies paralyzed without conventional engagement. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot. Soldiers abandoned posts, desertions increased, and fear spread faster than bullets ever could. In some ways, the Shadow Warrior program had shortened the war, yet at a cost that was deliberately hidden from the public. The program's legacy continued into the Cold War. Declassified documents reveal operations under code names like Knight, Wind, and Heritage Warrior, recruiting new generations of operatives from Apache bloodlines. Korea, Vietnam, Guatemala, and Iran became stages where these men, who officially did not exist, deployed their terrifying mix of traditional Apache techniques and modern psychological warfare. Reports consistently describe enemies encountering forces that seemed supernatural, invisible, and unstoppable, soldiers who could kill without being seen and terrorize without firing a weapon. Yet, for every strategic victory, the personal cost was monumental. Soldiers returned unable to reintegrate into society, some institutionalized, others wandering in isolation. Letters from men like David Nighthorse and Thomas Naich revealed trauma that never healed. A life defined by shadow operations, secrecy, and the unrelenting weight of what they had become. The military had created unparalleled weapons, but in the process, it had created ghosts, living and dead, whose experiences would never be fully acknowledged. The Shadow Warrior program, hidden in classified vaults for decades, left behind a paradox: extraordinary tactical success alongside profound human devastation. The world remembers battles, victories, and defeats, but these operatives, men trained in the darkest arts of psychological warfare, exist in the margins, their contributions erased, their suffering invisible. The war ended for most, but for them, it never truly ended. The shadows they cast remain, haunting history, families, and perhaps even the future of covert warfare. Spring 1944, Italy's rugged mountains became the stage for a mission that would test the full extent of the Apache shadow operatives' skills. A German division had entrenched itself near Monte Cassino, their positions fortified with trenches, minefields, and observation posts. Conventional Allied forces had been stalled for weeks, suffering heavy casualties. It was time for the Shadow Warrior units to act. 12 operatives, under the cover of darkness, navigated the treacherous terrain, moving silently over jagged rocks and through dense underbrush. Each step was calculated, every sound measured. The men carried no radios, no artillery, only small packs of equipment designed to manipulate the senses, chemical compounds that induced fear, and devices that produced subsonic frequencies that rattled the human mind. They were not just soldiers. They were hunters, shadows with lethal intent. The first night, the operatives struck psychological terror into the entrenched German forces. Tiny objects were shifted, trenches subtly rearranged, and markers carved into trees that induced an unshakable sense of being watched. Whispers, amplified through hidden acoustic devices, echoed through the valley, causing soldiers to question reality. Panic spread as men abandoned positions, some fleeing into minefields, others accidentally firing on their own comrades in confusion. By the third night, chaos was complete. German officers reported sightings of figures moving impossibly fast, appearing and disappearing, with faces painted in patterns that reflected moonlight like fire. Their logs described men hanging from cliffs, shadows in impossible positions, and sounds that could not be traced to any source. Entire units surrendered without engaging in conventional combat. Captured diaries later described soldiers terrified by forces that were everywhere and nowhere, like ghosts of the mountains themselves. In the chaos, the Shadow Warriors infiltrated key command posts, gathering intelligence, sabotaging communications. and leaving messages in German handwriting that indicated supernatural intervention. The combination of psychological and tactical precision paralyzed the enemy. Allied forces moved in behind the Apache operatives, encountering minimal resistance. In less than a week, the German stronghold was neutralized with virtually no casualties on the Allied side. But the mission's success came at a cost. Operatives returned physically unscathed, but psychologically, they were fraying. Lieutenant Robert Chino noted in his journal, "Every operation like this leaves a mark. The fear we instill in others takes root in us as well. We are beginning to see what the elders warned us about. Once a man becomes a shadow, he can no longer exist as he once was." Some operatives stared for hours, lost in memories of terror they had inflicted. The faces of the frightened enemy burned into their minds. Back at Fort WWII, psychologists documented symptoms unlike any previously observed: insomnia, extreme hyper-awareness, hallucinations, and, in some cases, dissociation. The men were extraordinary on the battlefield, but the shadow of their actions clung to them relentlessly. Reports described operatives who refused to enter buildings without checking every corner, who slept outdoors to avoid confined spaces, and who spoke in languages unknown to even the most experienced linguists. The Monte Cassino mission became a defining example of the Shadow Warrior program's capabilities, combining ancient Apache stealth tactics with psychological warfare, modern chemical agents, and acoustic manipulation to achieve total domination of enemy forces. It was a perfect storm of fear, strategy, and human ingenuity, but it also illustrated the irreparable human cost of wielding such power. By the end of the mission, both enemy and operative alike were forever changed. The mountains of Italy bore witness to the triumph of shadows over bullets, but also to the emergence of men who had crossed the line from soldier to weapon, from human to ghost. The success at Monte Cassino reverberated far beyond Italy. Reports from other theaters of war began noting similar phenomena: enemy troops abandoning fortified positions without direct engagement, entire units succumbing to terror that could not be explained by conventional tactics. The Shadow Warrior program had proven its effectiveness, but it was also becoming painfully clear that the operatives themselves were transforming in ways that could not be reversed. In the dense jungles of the Pacific, the operatives' missions mirrored the psychological intensity of Monte Cassino. In Mindanao, Japanese troops reported attacks by invisible forces, the silent stalking of soldiers, strange symbols carved into trees, and disorienting sounds that made entire platoons surrender or flee. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji's diary, recovered posthumously, described soldiers collapsing in terror, some dying from stress-induced cardiac events. The reports were dismissed as exaggerations in the official records, but the psychological impact was very real. The Shadow Warriors had perfected a form of warfare that targeted the mind first, the body second. At Fort WWII, the program's overseers faced an unsettling dilemma. While operational success was undeniable, the mental health of the operatives deteriorated with each mission. Nightmares, hypervigilance, hallucinations, and dissociative behaviors became routine. Letters from men like Thomas Naich and David Nighthorse spoke of experiences that blurred the lines between life and mission, reality and training. "Every night I dream of the eyes of men I have terrified," Naich wrote. "I hear their screams, even when no one is around. We have become the shadows, and the shadows do not rest." Even within the military hierarchy, concern began to surface. Captain James Morrison's reports warned that while the Shadow Warriors were extraordinary assets, their reintegration into society or conventional military roles was increasingly impossible. Many operatives refused to interact with other soldiers. Some became violent without warning, and others simply vanished, choosing the wilderness over the confines of any base. Yet the War Department pressed forward. The strategic value of psychological domination outweighed concerns for human cost. Across the Atlantic, German units continued to report encounters with what they called ghost soldiers in forests, towns, and abandoned villages. Intercepted letters from German officers painted a consistent picture of men who were untraceable, unkillable in conventional terms, and who left behind an aura of fear that spread faster than any propaganda. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a single shot, demonstrating the long-term efficacy of the Apache-inspired tactics. The effects extended beyond immediate military victories. Families on Apache reservations continued to report disappearances. Young men recruited under the guise of honor or opportunity vanished without a trace, echoing the post-war recruitment patterns that would later emerge in the Cold War. Tribal elders spoke in hushed tones of the cost. Warriors who returned were haunted, altered, and unable to reintegrate. Those who did not return were erased from history. leaving communities to mourn in silence. By the end of 1944, it was clear the Shadow Warrior program was not just a tool of war. It was an experiment in human transformation. It blurred the lines between soldier, weapon, and ghost. Every victory carried a cost. Every operation left scars, and the men who wielded this power were irrevocably changed. Yet the military hierarchy remained unyielding, focused on results, unconcerned with consequences. The shadows of Monte Cassino and the Pacific jungles did not end with the battles themselves. They persisted in the operatives' minds, in the memories of terrified enemies, and in the silent corridors of classified archives. The war was over, but the program's legacy continued, unseen, unacknowledged, and profoundly unsettling. As 1945 unfolded, the full scope of the Shadow Warrior program's consequences began to emerge. While the operatives had achieved unparalleled military success, the cost to their minds, bodies, and souls was immense. The men who had returned from missions like Monte Cassino and Mindanao were not the same who had left. They moved differently, thought differently, and often existed on the margins of both military and civilian life. Some could no longer form attachments. Others spoke in languages no one understood, or exhibited behaviors that defied comprehension. The training had unlocked primal ancestral skills, but it had also created trauma that could not be erased. Families of the operatives were left in limbo. Official military records acknowledged only a fraction of the men who had survived, while hundreds more simply vanished. Letters home were censored, and telegrams reported classified reassignment or death in action, often without providing a body or details. Reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma became places of quiet grief. Young men continued to disappear, recruited under promises of serving their country in ways that honored their heritage. Tribal elders whispered that the program had never truly ended. Its methods, its shadows, had persisted. Evolving in secrecy beyond the war. In military circles, the Apache units were simultaneously feared and revered. Reports documented entire battalions surrendering without combat, enemy troops succumbing to psychological terror, and operations executed with surgical precision. The methods pioneered by the Apache Shadow Warriors became the blueprint for modern psychological operations, influencing strategies in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. Yet for the men themselves, every victory left invisible scars. Post-mission reports describe operatives experiencing chronic insomnia, hypervigilance, dissociation, and in some cases violent outbursts. Their humanity had been partially sacrificed for the sake of tactical superiority. Government and military officials faced a dilemma. The operatives were extraordinarily effective, but reintegration into normal life was often impossible. Facilities like the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center attempted to help, but isolation, experimental treatments, and the psychological weight of their missions ensured that few fully recovered. Letters from soldiers like Thomas Naich and David Nighthorse reveal men who had been fundamentally altered, living in a liminal space between shadow and human, unable to fully return to civilian life. Those who disappeared entirely became ghosts, leaving families and communities in mourning without closure. The broader impact of the Shadow Warrior program extended beyond individual operatives. Enemy forces, traumatized by the psychological tactics employed, suffered not just physical losses but moral and emotional collapse. Entire regions experienced fear so profound that traditional military victories were achieved with minimal engagement. In essence, the Apache units had rewritten the rules of warfare, breaking the enemy's spirit before the body, achieving victories through terror and psychological manipulation. Even decades later, evidence of the program's influence persisted. Reports from Cold War conflicts in modern battlefields describe operatives who employ tactics reminiscent of those pioneered by the Apache Shadow Warriors. Intelligence analysts speculate that new generations continue to be recruited and trained, perpetuating the legacy of a program that officially does not exist. The story of the Shadow Warriors is a cautionary tale of brilliance and brutality intertwined. While their operations may have shortened wars and saved countless lives on one side, the personal cost, the trauma inflicted upon themselves, and the ethical ambiguity of their actions remain deeply troubling. History remembers victories and defeats, but the men of the Shadow Warrior program, the ghosts who operated in the shadows, exist largely forgotten. Their sacrifice, though invisible, forever altered the face of modern warfare and left indelible marks on the human soul. The end of World War II did not mark the end of the Shadow Warrior program, it only shifted its focus. The military and newly formed intelligence agencies faced a profound dilemma. They had created operatives who were more than soldiers. These men were psychological weapons, capable of instilling terror, manipulating perception, and striking without trace. Yet, reintegrating them into conventional military or civilian life was impossible. Many were already irrevocably altered, haunted by the shadows of their own making. Families continued to mourn those who never returned. Entire generations of Apache men vanished, some recruited under false pretenses, others summoned to continue a program that supposedly no longer existed. Tribal elders recall the fear in their communities, mothers praying their sons would come back, brothers searching for siblings who were erased from all records, families forced to accept letters claiming death in combat without bodies or explanation. The program's legacy was etched into the collective trauma of these communities. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the continuation of the program became intertwined with Cold War priorities. Young Apache men were approached with promises of serving their country in secret, under the guise of national duty and honor. Some were sent to Korea, others to Vietnam, and still others to clandestine operations in Central and South America. Operatives like David Nighthorse described being trained in facilities that existed on no maps, underground bunkers carved into mountains, or remote desert compounds. The methods were even more extreme than during World War II. Drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological conditioning were combined with advanced acoustic, chemical, and electronic tools to create operatives who were part human, part weapon, and part ghost. The human toll remained staggering. Letters smuggled out of these facilities described operatives trapped in liminal states, unable to fully return to normal life. "We have become shadows," wrote Nighthorse. "We move through the world but are never part of it. We fight, we kill, we terrify, but we are not alive in the way we were meant to be." Veterans who survived the program often struggled with insomnia, hallucinations, and profound alienation. Some disappeared entirely, walking into the wilderness to escape the unbearable weight of their training and missions. The psychological effects extended beyond the operatives themselves. Enemy forces consistently reported encounters with untraceable combatants who seemed to appear and vanish at will, leaving fear and confusion in their wake. In Vietnam, Korean, and even Middle Eastern conflicts decades later, reports of phantom soldiers or silent hunters echoed the same techniques. Pioneered by the Apache shadow warriors, modern military analysts now acknowledge that the program's influence persists, though its participants remain largely invisible. Government documents, partially declassified in the 21st century, confirm a continuation of heritage warrior operations into recent decades, with budgets allocated to secretive programs that trace directly back to the original shadow warriors. Yet the programs remain officially unacknowledged. Their existence is hidden, their successes unrecorded, their human costs obscured. The fallout is both ethical and personal. While the shadow warriors achieved tactical brilliance and altered the course of battles, the individuals involved were forever changed. Some live in remote isolation, haunted by memories of what they did and what they became. Families carry the burden of knowing their loved ones served in ways that cannot be spoken of and paid, a price that can never be measured. Communities remember the missing, the changed, and the ghosts. Their stories whispered but never officially told. The Shadow Warrior program, though invisible in official history, left an indelible mark. It demonstrated the terrifying potential of psychological warfare and human transformation, but it also left behind a trail of trauma, vanished men, and a legacy that challenges moral understanding. These ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, continue to walk among us. Their presence a silent reminder of a war that never truly ended for those who served in the shadows. The war that ended in 1945 left behind a world eager for peace. Yet for the Shadow Warriors, the battle never truly ceased. Those who had been trained in the hidden canyons of Arizona, in secret underground facilities, carried the echoes of terror and skill into a world that could never fully understand them. They were soldiers, yes, but also something else living. Instruments of fear, forged in silence and shadow. Families of the missing continued their quiet mourning, aware that their fathers, brothers, and sons had served in ways that history would never acknowledge. Reservations whispered of vanished men, of warriors who returned changed, and of the unseen presence of those who had walked the line between human and ghost. The program's legacy was more than records and reports. It was etched into memory, into the collective consciousness of communities whose bloodlines had borne the weight of war's hidden horrors. Decades later, the traces of the Shadow Warrior program still surfaced. Declassified documents hinted at operations stretching into the Cold War, even into modern conflicts. And anecdotal reports spoke of operatives who moved through the world unseen, influencing events without recognition. They were proof that some battles transcend time, that some warriors never stop fighting, and that the consequences of human ingenuity and cruelty echo far beyond the battlefield. The Apache Shadow Warriors were a secret history of brilliance, brutality, and loss. They demonstrated what could be achieved when fear became a weapon and the human mind a battlefield. But they also reminded the world of the costs hidden behind victory. These men, these ghosts, may never be honored in memorials or history books. Yet their story persists in whispers, documents, and memories. History remembers the wars, but it is the ghosts in the shadows who carry their lessons forward. And in that silent inheritance, we glimpse both the power of fear and the enduring question: at what cost do we wage it?